What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I learned that money can buy a chair at the wedding, a table near the dance floor, and even silence in the family group chat, but it cannot buy respect. And I felt that truth hit me like a punch when I stood there watching my daughter walk down the aisle on the arm of her stepfather, while someone whispered loudly enough for me to hear that her real father was nothing more than the money, not the dad. In that moment, I said nothing, because saying something would have ruined her picture, and as strange as it sounds, I cared more about protecting her perfect picture than protecting my own dignity, even though I had paid for nearly every piece of that picture. From the flowers that smelled artificial but looked expensive to the venue that Derek, the stepfather, bragged about negotiating when it was my credit card that secured the deposit. For months leading up to the ceremony, I kept my head down and wrote the checks, telling myself that this was about Emily's happiness and not about me, even when I knew the way decisions were being made did not involve me at all. Derek spoke with the planner directly. Ruth, my former mother-in-law, supervised the family seating chart like she was writing military orders, and Jason, my ex-husband, the so-called biological father, floated in and out with suggestions that were politely ignored until Derek repeated them as if they were his own, suddenly brilliant. I told myself it was easier to let them play house if it meant avoiding arguments, so I signed off on costs and tried not to notice that every credit card receipt carried my name while every plan was signed off with someone else's smile. The ceremony itself was the breaking point, not because I did not expect Derek to walk her down the aisle. I knew that weeks in advance, but because of how it was staged, how my place in her life was rewritten in real time. I was asked to sit at a certain table, positioned for convenience, not respect, and told that a speech would not be necessary since Emily and Derek had planned something special together. The whisper that called Jason nothing more than money was not meant for me, yet it landed on me, and all I could think was, if Jason is only the money, then what am I? Because I am the one who paid for this entire scene while being told to smile quietly and take it like a guest. I kept quiet through the toasts, through the rehearsed jokes about bonus dads and modern families, through the photographer's directions that cut me out of certain shots. My silence was not because I agreed, but because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of labeling me as bitter or jealous. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the performance. By the end of the night, I left before dessert, not storming out, just quietly excusing myself, and no one seemed to notice until the group chat lit up the next morning with the fallout. That is when the first voice notes came in. Emily's voice was frantic, apologizing but not apologizing, saying she loved me, that she wanted me to know how much she appreciated everything I had done, but also explaining how she felt trapped by traditions, by Derek's confidence, by Ruth's insistence that this was the right way to handle blended family optics. She said she did not want me to feel erased, that she thought I understood, that I had agreed by not saying anything. I listened to every note, one after another, hearing my daughter's guilt crash into her pride, her explanations sounding like rehearsed lines mixed with real panic, and it hurt more than the whisper at the ceremony, because it proved she knew, all along, that what they were doing to me was wrong. I did not reply, not at first, because replying would mean either forgiving too quickly or exploding too harshly, and I wanted neither. Instead, I opened my laptop and went through the payments. Derek had insisted on handling some final invoices directly with the planner and the florist, telling me not to worry about the details, but I had quietly placed the funds in escrow accounts tied to completion reports, the kind where every receipt requires a matching deliverable. I had done it for practical reasons, to protect myself from overbilling, but in that moment it became my first line of quiet revenge. I froze those funds. Calmly, clinically, without fanfare, I sent notices that final disbursements would not be released until missing reports were filed correctly, and since Derek had positioned himself as the manager, the missing reports had his name attached to them. It was not dramatic, not even public, but it was clean, and it forced him to sit where I had sat for months, powerless to move forward without someone else's approval. For once, he would have to answer to me, not the other way around. That night, as I waited to see how long it would take for Derek to notice, I received an email from the planner. She had forwarded me an entire chain I had never been copied on, a back and forth between Derek, Ruth, and Jason about how to position me at the wedding without making it look like I was excluded. My name was everywhere in that chain, dissected like I was a problem to be managed, and the more I scrolled, the more I realized this was not about tradition or optics, it was about control, about rewriting the story of who mattered in my daughter's life. I sat there, staring at the screen, thinking I had reached the limit of humiliation at the ceremony, but this was worse, because it showed me that my silence had been taken as permission to cut me out entirely. And that realization burned deeper than anything else. And as I closed the laptop, I knew one thing for certain. The picture they tried to stage was not finished, because I had just found the brush they forgot I still held. When I opened the forwarded email chain from the planner, I expected maybe a few logistical notes, perhaps some harmless chatter about the schedule or a reminder about the caterer, but what I found instead was a running commentary about me, written like I was a piece of unwanted furniture that needed to be shoved into the corner without causing too much noise, and the words were not cruel in the loud, obvious way that makes you angry on the spot, but in the casual, bureaucratic way that reveals. People have sat around a table and calmly discussed how to erase you without anyone noticing, which somehow cuts deeper because it tells you that erasing you is not an accident or a slip, but an intentional plan dressed up as practicality. The thread began with Derek suggesting that I should be given a good table near the front so she feels included, and those words, so she feels included, burned into me. Because it was not about including me in truth, but about giving me a prop seat in their little play, the kind of gesture that looks polite in pictures, but in reality is condescending and empty. Then came Ruth, always the strategist, adding her piece about how it would look confusing if too many people gave speeches, and how, since I was already covering the bills, perhaps I would prefer not to be burdened with public speaking, as if my silence were a favor they were graciously extending. Jason chimed in with a line that made me want to throw the laptop across the room. She's not the type to make a fuss, let's keep it smooth, because it was the exact sentence that explained why all of them thought they could get away with this. They assumed I would keep my mouth shut no matter what, that I would never fight back, that I would just swallow every humiliation for the sake of keeping the peace. Reading those words, I felt years of suppressed anger boil up, not just from the wedding, but from every holiday, every family gathering, every time I had chosen silence over confrontation, so Emily could have what she thought was harmony. When in reality, what she got was a staged show where I paid the bill and someone else played the starring role. For the first time, I let myself admit that silence had never been noble. It had been complicity, and that realization hurt, but also clarified something. If I kept choosing silence, they would keep treating me as the B-team parent, the one whose role was simply to bankroll and not disrupt, and I was done with that role. So I did something that none of them expected. I drafted a message and sent it not just to Derek and Ruth, but to the entire vendor group and both sides of the family, every single person who had been involved in staging this performance. The message was simple, calm, and precise. I explained that all media releases tied to my payments were revoked until credits were corrected to reflect the truth of who funded what and who made final decisions, and that meant no photos, no videos. No promotional reels from the photographer or venue could go public until proper acknowledgments were made. I did not scream, I did not accuse, I did not rant. I simply pulled the one lever I knew they could not ignore, because appearances were everything to them, and appearances could not exist without my permission. The silence after I sent that email lasted less than a minute before Derek replied, his tone furious, but wrapped in the false professionalism he loves to use, insisting that I cannot do that because everything had already been signed and sealed. I almost laughed when, 30 seconds later, the planner herself replied to the entire group with 4 words that made me feel a surge of vindication, so sharp I had to stand up and pace. She already did it. Suddenly, all of their carefully managed optics were crumbling, because without my release the glossy wedding they had built could not be published, could not be paraded on social media, could not become the legacy photo album they wanted to curate for themselves. And as I sat there watching their panic unfold, I realized this was the first time in years that I had forced them to see me not as an optional prop, but as the one person who could actually decide what went public and what stayed private. For once, I was not the B-team parent sitting quietly at a managed table. I was the one holding the only microphone that mattered, and I had no intention of handing it back until every single one of them learned that silence was not the same as weakness. But the victory was not sweet for long, because just as I was starting to enjoy the first flicker of control, another email arrived in my inbox, one that made me pause. It was not from Derek, not from Ruth, not even from Emily. It was from Jason, who had always been the one to hover on the sidelines, the one who never truly fought, but also never truly disappeared, and the attachment he sent was not about the wedding at all. It was a document with a letterhead I recognized instantly, because it belonged to the law firm Derek used for his business, and as soon as I saw that logo at the top of the page, I knew this was not just about photo credits or seating charts anymore. It was something bigger, something uglier, and something that told me the wedding had only been the opening act in a much larger performance, one where my silence was expected not just at a ceremony, but in the very framework of how this family was going to operate moving forward. And as I clicked the file open, I understood that the next move would not just decide how Emily remembered her wedding, but how all of us would live with one another for the rest of our lives. When I opened the document Jason had forwarded, my heart sank, not because I was shocked that Derek would try something manipulative. By then I had already learned that manipulation was his default language, but because of the way Jason's name appeared on the signature line, placed beneath a carefully worded non-disparagement agreement that was meant to muzzle him, and by extension me, from ever raising questions about how the wedding had been handled, how the family narrative was being spun, or how Emily was being steered into treating her real parents like the supporting cast in Derek's picture-perfect production. And in that moment I understood that this was no longer about a wedding weekend. This was about setting a precedent for how every major milestone in Emily's life would be controlled going forward, and I knew I could not let it stand. The document itself was not complex in the way corporate contracts often are. It was simple but brutal, designed to be easy to sign without thinking, cloaked in legal language about protecting family harmony and ensuring positive legacy preservation, but what it really said was that Jason would agree never to speak publicly or privately about being excluded from the ceremony in exchange for receiving access to professional photos and videos. And while some people might laugh at the idea of photos being used as leverage, I saw it for what it really was, a test, a small rehearsal of how Derek and Ruth intended to manage dissent, conditioning everyone around them to trade silence for scraps of acknowledgement. And it made me realize that if Jason signed that paper, it would not be long before I was presented with a similar one, expected to buy my way into invisibility with my own compliance. What none of them knew, and what I had almost forgotten myself until that night, was that years earlier, after the divorce, I had worked with a lawyer to establish a modest trust fund for Emily, earmarked for milestones like college, a down payment on a first home, or yes, a wedding, and while the fund itself was not massive, it was meaningful enough to matter, and I had insisted on inserting a clause that my attorney at the time had called petty insurance, but that I had felt strongly about. Because it said that funds could only be released if both biological parents were treated with basic fairness at any major ceremonial event tied to the money, and if either parent was excluded or publicly diminished without prior written agreement, then disbursements would pause until a joint corrective statement was issued. At the time it felt almost paranoid, like a line I would never need to draw, but when I remembered it that night, scrolling through Jason's panicked email, I felt a surge of vindication, because suddenly I realized I had been holding a weapon they never suspected existed. The next morning I called the trustee, a measured man who had always treated me with polite detachment, and I explained what had happened at the wedding, how Jason had been sidelined, how I had been treated as nothing more than a sponsor, and how Derek and Ruth had gone out of their way to erase our roles from the picture, and I asked him whether the fairness clause applied. He did not hesitate. He said yes, the clause was triggered the moment one parent was denied ceremonial acknowledgement, and the moment another was reduced to just the money, especially when the records showed that all funds came from my account, not Derek's. He told me that under the trust's terms, the remaining payments, which included not only the final vendor balances, but also the honeymoon allotment and a discretionary bonus I had quietly added as a gift, were frozen until a corrective action was documented. Knowing that, I sat back in my chair and let the weight of it settle in, because I had not just paused a few payments, I had stopped the machine they had built to run on my silence, and for once I was not playing defense but offense. And that shift felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When I finally spoke to Emily later that day, I did not yell and I did not break down. I simply explained that the money was paused, not canceled, that the trust was designed this way from the beginning, and that if she wanted it released, she and both her fathers, yes, I used that word deliberately, would need to sign a joint acknowledgement of what had happened and outline how future events would be handled differently. At first, she went quiet, and then her voice cracked, not with anger, but with something closer to panic, and she said words that made me stop cold. I did not want it that way. Hearing that, I felt both fury and pity, because if she did not want it that way, then whose way was it? And of course I already knew the answer, but the fact that she said it out loud shifted something, because it meant she was not blind, she was not heartless. She was cornered, and now she was reaching out for me, maybe for the first time in years, without Derek or Ruth feeding her lines. I told her calmly that I believed her, but belief did not erase what had been done, and if she wanted me to help her untangle it, she would need to stop hiding behind excuses and start standing beside me. That night, after we hung up, I received another round of messages, this time not from Emily but from Ruth, who called me heartless, accusing me of sabotaging my own daughter's happiness out of spite, and from Derek, who threatened to handle it himself, as though he were the CEO of a family corporation, and I were just a disgruntled shareholder to be pushed aside. Their rage only confirmed for me that I had struck at the one place they feared losing control, the financial backbone of their narrative, and I knew then that the battle had just escalated beyond optics and seeding charts into something far more consequential. And just as I was trying to decide how to respond, Emily sent me another voice note, this one shorter than the rest, but with a single sentence that changed everything and made me realize the war I thought I was fighting was not even the real one. Because she whispered, almost like a confession, "Mom, you were right about him." When Emily sent me that message, barely more than a whisper, telling me that I had been right about him, it felt like the ground shifted under my feet, not because I needed her validation or wanted her to admit fault, but because it was the first time she had cracked the polished surface of the story Derek and Ruth had constructed, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she was speaking to me as a daughter and not as a performer repeating someone else's lines. And the weight of those words hung in the air so heavily that I replayed them again and again, trying to understand whether they came from desperation, anger, or finally a clear-eyed recognition of how much she had been controlled. I did not rush to respond, because instinct told me this was not the kind of moment you cheapen with quick comfort or false promises. So instead, I let the silence breathe until she called me directly, her voice shaking as she explained how Derek had convinced her that the optics of her wedding mattered more than her own comfort, that a polished family picture would protect her from gossip, from judgment, from whispers about divorce and blended families, and that my feelings, though valid, had to be sacrificed for the greater good of appearances. She told me Ruth had echoed those same arguments, framing it as tradition, insisting that nobody wanted to see a divided aisle or hear competing speeches, and that unity was more important than truth. Listening to her, I realized that she had been caught between guilt and pride the whole time, ashamed to admit she hated how it was unfolding, but too scared to push back against the people who convinced her they knew best. I told her, slowly and calmly, that I could not undo what had already happened, and that I had no interest in humiliating anyone or turning her wedding into a battleground, but that I also could not allow silence to keep erasing me, and I suggested something that took her by surprise. I proposed that instead of waiting for Derek or Ruth to draft statements and control the narrative, she and I should work together to issue a correction, not a bitter rant or an attack, but a short, factual acknowledgement to both families and vendors. One that simply told the truth about who funded the event, who was excluded, and how things would be handled in the future. She hesitated, asking whether that would make everything worse, but I explained that it would do the opposite, that it would strip away the performance and put the real story back in her hands, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she sounded relieved, as if someone had handed her permission to stop pretending. We spent hours drafting that message together, trimming it down until it was lean and undeniable, and when we finally sent it out, it landed like a quiet press conference, a statement nobody could argue with because it carried no insults. No exaggerations, just truth, and the silence that followed was louder than any protest, because suddenly the picture-perfect image Ruth and Derek had tried to stage was cracked open, and everyone knew it. But I did not stop there, because I knew that statements alone would not change behavior, so I set boundaries with teeth, the kind that could not be ignored or softened by charm. I told Emily, and by extension everyone else, that any photo releases or captions that erased Jason or me from the narrative would immediately void any ongoing support I had promised for extras, including the honeymoon upgrades and vendor bonuses Derek had boasted about in my name, and I meant it. At the same time, I quietly arranged something for Emily that I knew she had wanted all along but had been talked out of by Ruth, who insisted it was too casual for a wedding weekend, a small brunch with her closest friends, the kind of gathering where she could actually breathe without staging herself for cameras. I paid for it, told her she controlled the guest list entirely, and I did not attend, because this was not about me claiming space, but about her reclaiming her own, and when she called afterward, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks, I knew the gesture had cut through the fog in a way no legal clause ever could. The victory was quiet but profound, because for once Emily had an event that was hers alone, free from Derek's brand management and Ruth's obsession with appearances, and that single experience planted a seed I knew would grow. Still, I understood the battle was not over, because people like Derek never back down after losing ground. They doubled down, and I was proven right the very next morning when Jason forwarded me a new document Derek had asked him to sign. This time it was not about the wedding itself, but about the future, a broader non-disparagement agreement that would silence Jason not just about the ceremony, but about any family matter going forward, essentially binding him to permanent compliance if he wanted access to Emily's milestones, and the chilling part was that the letterhead was the same, Derek's business attorney, not a family lawyer, not a mediator, but someone whose job was to craft contracts that protected reputations and assets, which told me everything I needed to know about Derek's true motivations. He was not trying to protect Emily, he was trying to protect his brand, his image as the flawless stepfather who had seamlessly stepped into a role that was never his to begin with, and now he was extending that control into the future, building a framework where silence and obedience were bought with crumbs of acknowledgement. Seeing that document, I knew the stakes had escalated again, because this was not just about my daughter's wedding anymore. This was about who would own the story of our family, and I decided then and there that the next move would not be quiet, it would be final. And it would be mine. When Jason forwarded me that second contract, the one that tried to stretch silence into the future like a leash, I knew that Derek had moved beyond simply staging a wedding. He was building a system of control, one in which every decision, every memory, and every narrative about our family would be filtered through him, polished until it fit his vision, and weaponized against anyone who dared to remember things differently. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I allowed this to continue, if I allowed Jason to sign and Emily to comply, then my role as a parent would be reduced forever to the margins of an edited photo album, my existence acknowledged only in checks cashed and whispers silenced, which was something I could not and would not accept. I spent that night combing through every clause in the trust, every payment ledger, every invoice I had filed, and with each document I opened, I saw how thoroughly I had underwritten their version of reality, and how easily I could dismantle it if I chose. It struck me as almost ironic that Derek had underestimated me so completely, because while he was busy orchestrating optics, I had been quietly building structures, contracts, and safeguards that gave me levers he did not even know existed. And once I realized how much power I actually held, the fear I had carried for weeks was replaced by something sharper, something colder, and something much more effective: clarity. The next day, I arranged a meeting, not with Derek, not with Ruth, not with any lawyer, but with only two people, Emily and Jason, and I told them both that if they wanted me to continue playing any role in their lives beyond that of a distant sponsor, then we needed to sit together, face to face, and decide once and for all who was going to write the story of this family. We met in a neutral space, a small office at the trustees' firm. No flowers, no photographs, no stage, just 3 chairs and a table, and for the first time since the wedding, Emily looked like herself again, stripped of the polish Derek had plastered over her. And Jason looked exhausted but ready to listen, which was more than I could have hoped for. I laid everything out without theatrics: the frozen funds, the fairness clause, the non-disparagement agreements, the invoices still waiting for approval, and I told them that I was prepared to release every last dollar to pay out the honeymoon support, the vendor bonuses, and even a small emergency cushion in Emily's name only, but that it came with one condition, one change that cost nothing but meant everything. Emily would remove Derek as her emergency contact and legal next of kin, not because I wanted a title, but because she needed protection that was not tied to his brand, and she would update her records to reflect the reality of her family. That she had 2 biological parents who had earned their place through blood and history, not through spin and contracts. For a long moment, Emily said nothing, and I feared she would retreat back into excuses, but then she nodded, tears caught in her throat, and said that she had been waiting for someone to give her a way out without demanding that she torch her life in the process. Jason, perhaps for the first time, spoke firmly, saying that he would never sign Derek's gag order, that he had been weak at the wedding but would not be weak again, and in that moment, I felt something shift, not just between me and my daughter, but in the balance of power that Derek had tried so hard to secure. When the paperwork was updated and signed, I followed through on my promise, releasing the funds, closing out the accounts, and sending one final email to Derek with a single attachment: the updated trust distribution schedule. Stripped of any discretionary approvals, with every vendor correction listed in black and white, leaving him no room to argue, no space to maneuver, and no opportunity to spin the story in his favor. It was not a rant, not a threat, not a plea. It was simply the last invoice, cold, final, and undeniable, the kind of document that even he, with all his bluster and arrogance, could not ignore. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation or a screaming match, but something much quieter, which somehow made it all the more powerful. Emily called me after meeting with the trustee, not crying, not panicking, but calm, almost steady, and she asked me what time she could come over, as though nothing had happened, as though we were simply mother and daughter planning to spend an evening together. And in that single question, I heard the beginning of something new, something real, not polished for photographs or staged for appearances, but built from the truth we had finally chosen to face. Later that night, Jason sent me a text, a simple selfie of him and Emily, both half laughing, half embarrassed, the kind of picture that actually looked like family instead of a campaign ad, and underneath it he wrote, "Next time, I'll be on time." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "Me too," and for the first time since the nightmare of that wedding began, I felt like the story had shifted back into our hands, no longer Derek's to manipulate, no longer Ruth's to cure it, but ours to live. Flawed, messy, and real. And as I sat there, phone buzzing softly with messages that no longer felt like demands, but like invitations, I realized that revenge had never been about humiliating Derek or destroying Ruth. It had been about reclaiming space, about refusing to be erased, about showing my daughter that silence is not strength if it comes at the cost of your own dignity. And in that realization, I found the only victory that mattered. I had not just turned the tables, I had flipped the script. And in the end, the performance was over, the actors dismissed, and the story belonged to us again.